Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and what we've been doing over the last week or so is talking about what the best decks are in the metagame for the new Triumphant Light meta. All of the new cards came out, a lot of the new decks are really strong, some of the old decks have gotten better. We talk about it all the time on the channel, but we have, I would say, enough data and enough time of this new format with all of the new decks to really understand what the number one and what the number two and number three, what really the best decks in the format are. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take all of the data that we have so far in this first week or so of the Triumphant Light metagame, and I'm going to let you know what decks are the strongest decks that counter the top decks of the format. So let's get right into it, guys. Again, these are the best decks to counter all of the other most played top meta decks of this particular format. So first and foremost here, we're on the limitless.com page. This is the overall Triumphant Light, accumulation of data here. 70 tournaments, 11,000 players, and 26,000 matches. So a very large sample size here. And if we're at the top of the metagame, as we see, the number one most played deck by a very wide margin is Dialga and Arceus EX. We've known this, we've been talking about it. About 1,600 players, 15% of the meta share of this format has been Dialga and Arceus, and it actually has a very consistent win rate, 55%, which is actually really high. If you're new to the channel or if you don't, watch these videos very often, anything about 55 or up is extremely good. So yes, Dialga and Arceus by far the number one most played deck in this format, but also one of the most successful in terms of win rates. But what decks can we play to counter Arceus and Dialga? Well, the answer should be pretty simple. It's right here on the screen. It's actually Rampardos and Lucario. So let's go ahead and take a look at the matchups for Arceus. And as we see here, not a lot of, strong counterplay to this deck. Again, probably a very large reason why Dialga and Arceus is remaining as probably the top deck of this format. The matchups here are extremely good all across the board. As we see, the number one matchup for this deck is against itself. It's going to be about a 50-50. That's how it works. It's not exactly 50-50 because sometimes, matches go to ties. So 49, basically 50% win rate against itself. And then as we see, the number two most played deck is going to be Rampardos and Lucario. And the win rate here is only 37.5%. So that's a very big difference compared to all of the other matchups as we go down here that are all about 55+%, right? So against Palkia EX, that's 16 trainer Palkia or 18 trainer Palkia and Articuno, we have about a 56.5% win rate against those two decks, which is actually a very solid matchup spread. Against Darkrai Magnezone, almost 59%. Leafeon and Celebi, that's a 63%, and then Executor, 72%. Even Charizard, we have a 53%. If we go down to Arceus Crobat Toolbox, we have 55%. And it's not until we go down to Gallade EX that we have a 44 or a 45% win rate. So realistically, Gallade is technically a favorable matchup against Arceus and Dialga, but it's honestly not nearly as good as a counterplay to this deck as Rampardos and Lucario is. So that's kind of really all we're looking at. If we go down more, we do see a 41%, but that's against Lucario and Rampardos, so basically the same deck. Limitless just categorizes it somewhat differently. And against Gyarados and Druddigon, we do also have a 45% win rate. So Gyarados does technically have a somewhat favorable matchup, and if we go down here, some of these sample sizes are really small, so the data, we don't really have much to go off of here. Again, Gallade showing up again at 34%. So that's really kind of all we're looking at here. I think that fighting type decks that do significant damage are really the only counterplay to Dialga and Arceus right now. Now, the reason why I think Rampardos and Lucario, if we go back to the overall page, is the number two most played deck is kind of obvious because it's really the number one counterplay to the number one most played deck. We do see this oftentimes in metagames and as they develop. So things are really interesting here. I did not expect the format or this metagame to really be, settling at the top as much as, it is right now. I thought that we had a lot of other really strong decks, but honestly, I think a lot of people are just choosing to not play things like 18 trainer Palkia and Articuno, which realistically are the other two top archetypes of this format. So just really interesting to take a look at that. Now, again, Rampardos and Lucario really is the second most played deck of this format because it's really the only true hard counter deck to Dialga and Arceus. But it is the second most played deck, so you will be going against this deck pretty often, so why not? Let's go take a look. It also has a 52% win rate, so it is a very strong deck. So let's take a look at this deck's matchups, and we'll see what decks are particularly strong against Rampardos and Lucario. So as we see here, Articuno EX is really one of the only, or Articuno and Palkia 18 Trainer are two decks that are exceptionally strong against Rampardos and Lucario. So again, we're noticing a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors aspect of the format right now. But again, I don't think that that's really going to play too much on the overall landscape of the meta, because so many people, about twice as many people, are playing Dialga and Arceus than Rampardos and Lucario. So because it has such a firm grip on the meta share right now, yes, 18 trainer Articuno and Palkia does have a slightly losing matchup against Dialga and Arceus, but they both have really good matchups against Rampardos. So as we see here, bad matchups against Arceus at 61% win rate. Or sorry, a good matchup against Arceus at 61, 50-50 against itself, and then only a 38% win rate against Articuno 18 trainer, and 34% against Palkia 18 trainer. So these are very, very bad matchups. 38% and 35% is very, very tough for Rampardos and Lucario, and in my mind, that's really the one reason why I don't think that this particular list is ever going to see nearly as much play as Articuno and Palkia, because you got to kind of look at them as basically the same type of archetype. They are different, they have slightly different matchups, but realistically, if we go back to the Metashare tab, we see that 5.5% is playing Articuno and about 4% is playing Palkia. So if you combine that, that's about what is it? 10%, a little more, 10.5%. My math skills are tough. 10.5% basically, and if you combine those two, that would be the second most played archetype of this format. So yes, Rampardos and Lucario is technically the second most played deck, but really, if we're talking about 18 trainer water decks, whether it's Articuno or Palkia, when you combine them together, that brings us just about 10.5%. The other thing we can do is we can take a look at Leafeon Exeggutor, or Leafeon, and Celebi, and then Exeggutor and Celebi, which are different decks. They are actually pretty different in how they perform, but realistically, they are very similar. So basically, you combine those two decks, and that's also about 10.5. So realistically, what we're looking at in the metagame right now is that Arceus and Dialga, 15% of the meta share. The 18 trainer water decks are about 10%. And then the grass-type Celebi decks are about 10%. And then Rampardos and Lucario would really fall, what I would say realistically, in about the fourth most played deck slot. And it would be followed closely behind by Darkrai and Magnezone, and then things like Charizard. And then from there, it really does drop off pretty heavily. So yes, if we go back here, let's again take a look at the matchups for Rampardos and Lucario. We see that they do struggle pretty heavily against those 18 trainer decks, but also pretty handedly, we're struggling against Exeggutor and Celebi, whereas Leafeon and Celebi, we actually have a favorable matchup against. And I really think this comes down to the HP. Again, the sample size isn't anything super massive. It's 170 matches for Leafeon and 104 matches so far against Exeggutor. But this difference of about 20% is staggering. So again, I really do think it comes down to the ability for Exeggutor to live an attack from Rampardos much more consistently. It's got 20 more HP than Leafeon. And yes, we're less able to power up that Celebi, but the ability, I think, to live hits more consistently and force our opponent to not be able to KO us basically in one attack is pretty significant. So yes, like Lucario plus Rampardos is 150, and that is enough to KO Leafeon, but they're also running things like Sudowoodo and Hitmonlee. But realistically, Exeggutor with Giant Cape is 180 HP, plus the potions, plus Erika's. We should be above that damage threshold to get KO'd by Rampardos, and still hitting for weakness, so that should be pretty significant. And I think it's a pretty big reason, honestly, why Exeggutor has such a better matchup. So that's really, really interesting to take note, right? Again, against Rampardos and Lucario, Exeggutor does much better than Leafeon does. So that's a very interesting statistic. Against most other matchups, Leafeon and Exeggutor will have very similar win rates, but not in this particular matchup. So I think that's very, very interesting to note. If we go down a little bit, we do see that Arceus and Carnivine, the Turbo Grass aggro, Carnivine deck paired with Arceus, actually does have a very favorable matchup against Lucario and Rampardos, but also Weavile and Darkrai. So I think a big thing that this Rampardos and Lucario deck struggles against realistically is just more aggressive decks. And Exeggutor is also a very aggressive deck. So these sort of aggro, fast-paced decks that can do early damage from turn 1 can put a lot of early pressure on Lucario and Rampardos, which don't really have a lot of Pokemon that, I guess are strong in the early game, right? They're not running a lot of like basic EX Pokemon, right? They're all evolutions and fossils and Riolus in the active spots. So Arceus and Carnivine's a really, really interesting one. This is a deck that's seen a little bit more play recently, but I also think aggro grass is pretty decent right now in the format. It's kind of interesting because we do already have a very aggressive grass deck in Exeggutor, but at least we are able to do 130 damage with Arceus in this deck. So I actually do like Arceus and Carnivine. I think it deserves to see more play, at least in this metagame. However, it would probably struggle against things like Dialga and Arceus. But either way, if we go down a little bit, nothing here. The sample size isn't too big, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but yes, against Rampardos and Lucario, we do struggle pretty heavily against the 18 trainer water decks, but also these aggro grass decks like Executor and Carnivine. So very, very interesting for sure. And next up, let's take a look at the 18 trainer water decks, because they really are the number two or the number three, I would say, top contending I guess, archetypes in the game right now when you combine Articuno and Palkia. So let's take a look at Articuno first, and we'll kind of contrast its matchup spreads against Palkia. So we don't do very, very well against Arceus and Dialga. I would say Palkia does a little bit better than Articuno does for a variety of different reasons. We're just not doing that much damage a lot of times. Dialga can live 2 hits from an Articuno EX. We're also not super fast. We're very reliant on Misties to have great pace and to be aggressive. And sometimes we don't get Misties. And again, if we're going first and Dialga is going second, that can be really troublesome for us because they're able to Metallic Turbo and then go into Arceus on turn 3. So I think there's a lot of reasons why this matchup isn't great against for Articuno. But if we go down as well, Palkia actually has a slight advantage against Articuno, about a 48% win rate. So again, nothing super substantial. The sample size here isn't massive, 81 and 88. It's a pretty even matchup realistically, but technically speaking, Palkia does have the advantage in this head-to-head matchup. And if we go down here, it's actually very, very consistent. There's really nothing else other than like Pachirisu 18 trainer that does extremely well against 18 trainer Articuno. So these 18 trainer water decks are actually a lot better from a matchup consistency standpoint than you might expect. They really are really good across the board. I think it's a main reason why they have some of the highest win rates out of any deck in the format here, as we see 54% for 18 trainer Articuno. Now, if we take a look at Palkia, which again is very similar, but it should have slightly different matchup spreads. Okay, we have basically the same % win rate against Arceus and Dialga, so I lied a little bit there. But however, we are struggling as well here with Palkia against Darkrai Magnezone, but I don't actually really consider this to be, and Gyarados, I don't really consider this to be that much of a problem. In Charizard as well, those are small sample sizes. Actually, it's 18 and 19, basically the same deal. But yeah, realistically, Palkia and Articuno are very, very similar. They have really strong matchups against like basically everything in the format other than Arceus and Dialga, which I think is kind of a significant problem because again, Arceus and Dialga seeing more play than really any of the other archetypes, and hopefully in the coming weeks we see more representation for Rampardos and Lucario. That could help balance out the top of the metagame to really create at least a somewhat appropriate sort of rock, paper, scissors at the top of the metagame, which then would allow some balancing at the top, which should allow some of the other decks in like the tier 2 to really kind of maybe have a chance in some of these larger events. So I would like to see that as well. But yeah, interestingly enough, Palkia and Articuno both don't do great against Arceus and Dialga, and again, they are going to struggle a bit against Darkrai Magnezone, but realistically, Darkrai Magnezone, it has had a massive fall off in play. It's still about 5% of the meta share, but I think as time goes on, that's probably going down. It's sitting at around 51%, which is fairly good, I'm not gonna lie. But the next thing that we're gonna talk about, and this is really interesting, is Leafeon and Celebi and Executor and Celebi, because I did actually put Leafeon in the S tier of my tier list, and the reason for that was because it was floating around 50% or 49% for the first few days, but I actually expected that to rise, because I figured I figured the top of the metagame would balance out, where we would get less Dialga and Arceus over time. But that's not actually the case. It seems to actually be going in the opposite direction, and people are really, really favoring Arceus and Dialga. I suppose I did cover this deck, and I made a video on it that has a decent amount of like viewership, so maybe I kind of have also contributed to this factor, but realistically, yeah, more and more people are playing Dialga and Arceus, which I think for a variety of reasons makes Leafeon and Celebi maybe not the greatest choice right now. I think when you compare these grass Celebi decks to the 18 trainer water decks, yeah, what we see here is a massive difference in the average win rates, which again is actually really interesting because still a lot of people are playing these grass type decks. So a 36% win rate against Arceus, which is very, very bad. We also have a 48% win rate, so fairly even against Darkrai Magnezone, but not super favorable. And then we're actually technically losing here against Articuno EX and Rampardos and Lucario, which is again really, really tough. We're losing to Charizard, we're losing to Palkia. A lot of the top decks in the format we are not beating, and I think that really showcases the decks that people are favoring beside Leafeon and Celebi actually all do pretty well against Leafeon and Celebi. So I don't think that grass is nearly as well positioned right now in the format as I honestly expected it would be. There's a couple matchups that we do good against. Like if we go down against like some of the Arceus decks, we do good. Pachirisu, we do good. Some of the aggro decks like Magnezone, Skarmory, we do well against. But the sample sizes are pretty small. And realistically, if we're taking a look at all of the other top decks here, we honestly do not do very good against the 18 trainer water decks, Dialga and Arceus. So there's a lot of decks that actually counter Leafeon and Celebi. So this isn't really what I would even consider a top deck right now that we need to counter. And if we take a look at Executor, we see it has an even worse matchup against Dialga and Arceus, but a little bit more of a balanced matchup spread across some of the other top decks against Magnezone and Darkrai, against Leafeon, against Articuno. We do struggle against Charizard, of course, we always have. And then here we see a 61% win rate, honestly, against Rampardos and Lucario. So it's really interesting. I think as time goes on, honestly, I do think Executor will probably end up being a better overall deck than Leafeon Celebi, even though it does struggle more against Arceus and Dialga. This is a very, very bad matchup spread. 80 wins and 214 losses. I think this is honestly a big reason why Executor has kind of been gatekept out of the format. Again, there's a variety of reasons for this. Dialga can go up to 170 HP. Most of the time, you're living 2 to 3 hits from an Executor, which can really be the difference when you consider the fact that you're going to get a couple of metallic turbos off, then go into Arceus and just start sweeping through your opponent. You can one-hit KO Celebi with Arceus. So it really does kind of depend. Also, like with Executor, it is aggressive, but you're not guaranteed to get Executor on turn 2. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And even if you do get Executor, you might flip tails and just do 40 damage over and over again. With the potions, with the giant capes, you're just not fast enough. And we're not really setting up Celebi consistently enough. So it's interesting. If we're not able to KO Dialga early enough, then, you know, Arceus can kind of just start cleaning up. And then again, if we're not KOing Dialga, then Arceus can come in and then finish the job and even KO your Celebi as well. So it's just not a great matchup realistically, and it's kind of tough right now for Executor. And again, if we take a look at the Palkia matchup as well, smaller sample size, but 20 wins, 43 losses, 31% is actually pretty bad as well. So I would say the water decks are actually fairly good counters to the grass decks as well. And then lastly, I guess what we can quickly take a look at here is going to be Darkrai and Magnezone. This is kind of the same as it always has been, but the matchups have been refreshed. There's a lot of new decks. So let's take a look at what seems to be a good counter against Darkrai Magnezone, which again is really only like the 5th or 6th most played deck in the format. But as we see, Dialga and Arceus still heavily countering Darkrai Magnezone. And that's really the theme here. Dialga and Arceus really has a phenomenal matchup spread against every deck that people are playing in the metagame right now, other than Lucario and Rampardos. So very interesting, if we're being honest with you. We'll go back to that and we'll summarize here. But we also have a pretty bad matchup spread against Arceus and Crobat. So I think it really comes down to Arceus decks being able to do really significant amount of damage with the additional modifiers of Metallic Turbo and Dialga, or the extra damage from Crobat's ability. It really does add up to be able to KO Darkrai pretty consistently. Darkrai is cool, but it only does 80 damage. So like with giant capes and with potions, like we're really not doing enough damage to really contend with something like Arceus. Arceus honestly has power crept a lot of things in the format, and as we see, very bad win rate against Darkrai and Greninja as well. And yeah, I mean, everything else in here is fairly average. Again, it just really kind of falls down to right here against Arceus. 40% against the #1 deck in the format is pretty tough, honestly. So yeah, that's in summary what I would say. It's just gonna be a quick video today, are the counters to the top decks of the format. What's really interesting though is that if we go and we look at Dialga and Arceus here, and I just got good, and we're gonna wrap this up. The win rates here are incredible. I mean, there's really nothing that's seeing at least a lot of play or commonly played that is significantly strong against Arceus. Now, I do think that Gyarados and Druddigon might be kind of a sleeper in this format, and Gyarados decks in general, I feel like we're actually fairly good in the format right now, but I don't know if people are really looking to go back to play much Gyarados. But yeah, I mean, truthfully speaking, the best counter to the #1 deck in the format is definitely going to be Rampardos and Lucario. And again, that's pretty obvious. We've seen that, but 50 or 38% win rate is pretty good for Rampardos, but it's like, it's just, I don't know, like it doesn't feel like there's enough to counterplay Dialga and Arceus right now. And I think that's really why we're kind of just chilling at about 55%. It's just consistently the highest. It's not like we have like auto wins against a lot of decks. Like we are kind of auto winning against Executor and Leafeon. But other than that, it's all just very consistent, right? Like 56, 56, 58, 63, 71, 53, 55, 56, like 66. So it's all like, we just have like good matchups against basically the entire format with Arceus and Dialga. Other than Rampardos. So it's kind of weird. Like the format right now is turning out in a way that I did not expect it to. But again, I just wanted to make this video to at least kind of prove to you guys like the statistics, right? I like to inform you guys as well as I possibly can. So for this video, again, I just wanted to cover what all of the matchups are and what really all of the best counterplays are in the format. Now, what we can do technically is we can filter by win rate, and we can look at some of these smaller sample sizes that just don't make a ton of sense. But like, hold on, if we go down enough, we should be able to find, yeah, so right here, once we see like a certain amount of matches, like technically this Leafeon and Glaceon deck is 19-4, which is very, very interesting. So a deck like this, if I'm gonna, I guess, show it. Let's show it here. Open as image, here we go. So like this deck here technically has a really good matchup against Arceus and Dialga for whatever reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's a smaller sample size, but like technically that is the case. If we go back here, what else are we looking at? We're filtering by matchups, or win rates rather. Where are we? Oh no, we gotta go by win rate. We'll find something very specific here that's fairly good. Probopass and Skarmory, technically 82%, which is kind of funny. Let's find another big sample size. And here, Arceus and Magnezone. So here's a really interesting one. Arceus and Magnezone, which only has a 45% win rate. Not a large sample size, 154 wins, 181 losses, but this deck here is actually supposedly really, really good against Dialga and Arceus. So it's kind of interesting. Like we could pick through the statistics and we could kind of focus on stuff where the sample size is really small. But like realistically, there's really not anything that's commonly played right now that has a good Dialga and Arceus matchup. And I think it's actually a pretty significant problem with this format. I'm saying that the format's bad or anything, but realistically, I think that either Rampardos and Lucario needs to see like twice as much play to really balance things out, or people really need to start moving off of the grass decks, because the grass decks really aren't that good against the top decks of the format right now. And for that reason, I just don't actually think that they really should be seeing nearly as much play as they do. Not something that I expected to happen. Again, I was kind of wrong in assuming that. But I do think that, yeah, I think things will have to change. Again, this is over the entire first week. So basically like the next coming week will look a lot different from a matchup spreads in the meta shares than what we're taking a look at right now. This is as a cumulative total. So hopefully we're trending in the right direction. But like I said, yeah, Dialga and Arceus is very, very strong. Rampardos and Lucario is really the only counter to it. The water decks have pretty good matchups really across the board. But they do kind of struggle against Dialga and Arceus as well. So there it is, guys. That's what I would kind of consider to be what I believe, and what the statistics tell us, what the data tells us, are the best counters to the top decks of the format. Did anything surprise you in this video? Let me know. Hopefully this was somewhat informative to you guys. Maybe this was helpful. I'm not sure. Again, I just want to make sure that everybody understands, where all these decks are in the format, what decks are strong against them. We talk about it on a weekly basis and we kind of see things unfold, but it's sometimes good to just look at the statistics outright and, formulate kind of our strategies based off of that. So anyway, guys, I'm going to get out of here. Have a good Friday. Happy Friday. Good luck competing this weekend. Link will be down in the description below if you want to play in the Ursa Days tournament this weekend. I always sort of advertise that playing in the tournaments is really, really fun, and then you have a chance to make it onto my videos if that means something to you. Probably not, but either way, it's really, really fun to compete, and I definitely would recommend it. But either way, stay tuned. This weekend, we're going to do some more gameplay videos. I want to get back into doing some more gameplay on the channel when rank mode comes. We might do some ranked matches videos and, do some coverage about videos like that, doing ranked gameplay. So I'm kind of ramping up to that. But anyway, peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll talk to you guys later. And yeah, peace.